anglais, comme je vous l'avais dit, puisque notre ami Chris parle anglais avec un accent écossais tout à fait charmant. Donc, je vais vous dire un grand welcome to this new event of the Cercle franco-britannique, which is the second into the year, as you know, and one that is closely related to our forthcoming trip to Scotland in the beautiful Scorig Peninsula in October. And I must recall that there are still some places available for this trip on Po Alumni's website, which you all know of. Today, we are very pleased to welcome Chris Deerin, who is the director of Reform Scotland, a non-partisan policy institute which works to promote increased economic prosperity, more effective public services, and expanded opportunities for all Scots. And Chris is also a journalist working for the New Statesman, among other publications. This is, of course, a timely event for us because of the latest events that happened in Scotland over the last weeks. Indeed, in last mid-February, the charismatic Scottish Prime Minister and leader of the Scottish Nationalist Party, Nicola Sturgeon, announced her surprise resignation, arguing a little bit like Jacinda Ardern from New Zealand a little bit before her, that she wasn't able to give the job her fullest anymore. This has been a little bit like a groundbreaking news, and it happened against the backdrop of strained confrontations with London over the independence issue, and also against the backdrop of an SNP's slide in the polls. And to be sure, this event raises a series of interesting questions that we will debate with our guest tonight. The first one is, of course, how and why exactly did the resignation of Nicola Sturgeon happen, only 2 years after she was elected again for a third term as Prime Minister of Scotland in 2020. The second question we'll be asking our guest is, what is the record of Mrs. Sturgeon in power at St Andrew's House since 2014, when she took over from her predecessor, Alex Salmond? Another question that is interesting is, who is going to be the next SNP leader and thus the Prime Minister of Scotland in an internal contest that is going to end later this month, and I believe even this weekend. Another question, of course, is what is the future of the independence cause? And a last question, which could frame our debates, would be how is the event of Nicola Sturgeon's resignation going to change Scottish politics? Are we going to see a rise of Labour and other unionist political parties? And what will happen to the SNP in the next general British elections and in the next Scottish elections? So to answer all of this, Chris, I'm very happy to welcome you. Thank you very much for being with us tonight. It's a great pleasure for us to have you. Perhaps we can start our discussion with you recapitulating the context of Mrs. Sturgeon's departure from government in Scotland. How did this come about?
Good evening, everyone. I think, like everyone else, there was a sense that the end of Nicola Sturgeon's time as First Minister was coming, but that didn't mean it wasn't a huge surprise when she announced her resignation. She had been First Minister, which is the Prime Minister equivalent in Scotland, in the devolved Parliament for 8 years, which is the longest anyone has held that job. The Scottish Parliament is only about 20 years old, so there haven't been so many First Ministers. And before that, she was Deputy First Minister when Alex Salmond was First Minister. So she's been a huge figure on the scene of Scottish politics for, you know, really as long as we've had a Scottish Parliament, and especially since she became First Minister, she has been dominant to almost the exclusion of everyone else, and that was very much the way she wanted it to be. So I think the first 3 or 4 years went very well for her, and then really Brexit was the moment that I think her First Ministership changed, because we'd had a referendum on independence in 2014 and Scots had voted by 55% to 45% to stay in the Union. So that seemed to settle things to a degree for a period of time. But when the Brexit referendum happened in 2015, I think, was it? 20, no, sorry, 20, 60. Scots voted by 62% to 38% to stay in the European Union, but obviously we were forced to leave because England is so much bigger as a country. It has 55 million people to our 5 million people. So although England voted relatively narrowly to leave, the numbers were such that the whole of the UK had to leave. And at that point, Nicola Sturgeon decided that there had been what she called a material change in circumstances, and therefore it was appropriate for the Scottish government to call for a second independence referendum, even though it was only a few years after the first one. And really from that point on, her entire ministry became about attempting to get Scotland out of the United Kingdom. She constantly came up with new strategies, new arguments, new demands on the British government that there should be a referendum. Interestingly, the polling of the surveys of Scottish public opinion showed that only a minority wanted a second referendum. I think a majority would say they would like to see a referendum at some point in the future. It's always 3 to 5 years away, almost like just keeping it on the horizon as an option. But there was never a majority in favour of a second referendum, and indeed there hasn't been a majority in favour of independence as an outcome either. But Sturgeon continued to push this argument. I think her other policy platforms were sort of pushed to the side because it was all about independence for her. And it became, I mean, I was a no voter in 2014. I voted to stay in the Union, but I'm not completely against the idea of independence. But it became so all-consuming in Scottish politics, and there was no discussion about, you know, education or health or the economy particularly. All it was an ongoing and very boring argument about independence, because all the arguments and all the cases, the statistics, the arguments in favour, the arguments against, we'd had them all, and there was nothing particularly new to say. So it was really just a rhetorical case that she kept putting, and it became like a bit of a headache, really. And as a journalist, it was incredibly boring because I wanted to write about other things, but there wasn't anything else to write about. So every week you're writing a piece about independence again, and you know, if it was boring for me, I pity my readers, for whom it must have been incredibly dull. So we went through this process. We then obviously, as everyone did, had the period of lockdown over COVID, which things calmed a little bit then, and Sturgeon actually, in terms of how she managed that period, she gained a lot of respect from Scots, I think, for the reassurance that she gave us. The outcomes in terms of deaths and the rest of it weren't much better than, or any better than the rest of the UK, but I think compared to Boris Johnson, she was seen to be working very hard. She was seen to be, you know, there doing daily press briefings. She was very authentic and very empathetic in the way she dealt with it. And so that was a period where there was a bit more unity in Scottish politics. But then when we came out of that, we went straight back into the independence argument again. And added to that, you know, the SNP have been in government for a total of 16 years in Scotland, which is a long time for any government, really. Most of them, of any party, have kind of run out of ideas, and you know, they've tried the things they want to try. They've had resignations, they've had scandals, all the rest of it, and the SNP are no different. So she seemed to, in a sense, she was looking at what her legacy would be, because she knew she would probably go maybe by the next devolved election, which is in 2026. And the thing that really began the beginning of the end was when she began pursuing gender reform. So she brought a bill to the Scottish Parliament that would make it simpler and more straightforward for people who want to change gender. It would remove the need for any medical diagnosis. It would shorten the time they had to live in the new gender. And there was a big backlash against that from some feminists. J.K. Rowling, the author, was one of the leading voices against it, concerns about the impact that would have on women's rights. It split her party, and one of the strengths of the SNP is that it's always been incredibly united. You know, the party, as we're seeing in this leadership election, and we can come on to that, but the party has traditionally been full of people who don't really agree on anything other than independence. You have people on the right, you have people on the left, you have people in the centre, but because they have this shared ambition of independence. They have incredible unity, because that overrides everything else that they might disagree with. So suddenly you had this split in the SNP between some of these feminists and men who didn't think that the gender proposals had been thought through properly, who were concerned about the impact on women's rights and concerned about the impact on young people if the law was changed in such a way. The bill was passed. And then Westminster stepped in and for the first time used a thing called a Section 35 order, which has never been used in devolution before, which allows the Westminster government to block Scottish Parliament legislation if it would have an impact on matters that are reserved to Westminster. And the Equalities Act, which is a reserved matter at Westminster, it was felt that this legislation could have an impact on wider UK equalities legislation. So that created a big row, or a stushy, as we call rows in Scotland. And I think at that point, Sturgeon lost her sure-footedness. She lost the degree of support in her party. The country, in terms of opinion polling, was against, by quite a large majority, the gender reforms as she had them. So suddenly, she had always been very careful to stay on the right side of public opinion. She suddenly found herself on the wrong side of public opinion. And there were various other policy measures that she'd passed, which are not very interesting, but were equally unpopular, not as headline-grabbing as the gender thing. And so I think out of that, you had this sense that the government had lost its way. And then I think the final thing, I've talked too long on this, but the final thing was she wanted to have a new strategy for securing independence. And she came up with this idea of a de facto referendum, which was basically to use the next Westminster election, which will be next year. If the SNP got a majority of votes from Scottish voters, they would take that as a mandate to begin separation negotiations with the British government. Again, lots of people in her party didn't like that. The gold standard has always been a referendum, but suddenly they decided they didn't want to do that, and the majority of voters were against it. So Sturgeon, having been incredibly popular for such a long time, suddenly found that her personal poll ratings were dropping, support for independence was dropping, and for the first time in 16 years, support for the SNP was dropping. So I think she just looked at all that and thought, my race is run here. And I think she was tired after lockdown and everything. She said that Jacinda Ardern, when Jacinda Ardern announced her resignation and said she was exhausted, that she felt quite envious of that. So I think that planted a seed in her mind that it might be time to think about her own life and getting some kind of personal life back. And she came out and said she'd had enough and she was leaving. Caught us all by surprise. That was the kind of background to the decision.
I see, but there was also a judgment by the British Supreme Court about independence, rejecting, I think, the right of Scotland to try and organize a referendum by itself without the approval of Westminster, which is something that we knew of before, but which was reaffirmed another time. Did that play a role as well?
Yeah, yes, it did, so Sturgeon wanted to test whether Holyrood, the Scottish Parliament, could hold a referendum on independence under its own power. The 2014 referendum was an agreement between Westminster and the Scottish Parliament. So Westminster, if you like, licensed Holyrood to hold that referendum. What Westminster wouldn't do now is they wouldn't allow a second referendum. The Prime Minister, we've had Conservative governments, the Prime Minister just kept saying no. Pointing to the polls that I talked about, where there wasn't really an appetite amongst the Scottish electorate for a referendum. So Sturgeon passed a bill through the Scottish Parliament saying we are going to hold a referendum, and then she referred that to the Supreme Court, which is the sort of ultimate court in Britain. It sits in London. It has Scottish as well as English, Welsh, Northern Irish judges on it, and she referred her own bill to the Supreme Court for them to make a decision as to whether Scotland had the right to call a referendum or whether it had to ask Westminster for permission. The Supreme Court came back and said this power lies with Westminster, and that's when Sturgeon moved on to the de facto, let's use the next general election as the equivalent of a referendum, because she felt that there wasn't really any kind of democratic route at that point for Scotland to hold a second referendum. It was basically up to a Conservative Prime Minister, an English Conservative Prime Minister at Westminster, a government that is largely populated by English MPs who were would decide whether Scotland could have a referendum or not. So you could see her point in a way, but coming back to the point I made, which is simply that the Scottish electorate didn't want a referendum. So she was kind of pushing people into a corner on something that they weren't very happy to be pushed into a corner on. And that began to unstitch her very positive relationship with the Scottish voters.
I see. And by the way, why didn't the British government ask the Supreme Court about the legality of a Scottish referendum initiated on its own before? Because maybe this would have helped to, close the independence debate before, shortly after the last referendum in 2014.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I mean, I think in a sense after the 2014 referendum, the British government just hoped independence would go away. You've had your vote, you've said no, so can you just stop talking about it for a while so that we can get on with running the country properly? The other thing is, of course, the British government's had its own problems to deal with. The small matter of Brexit, which has really dominated Westminster politics since 2016. In fact, still dominates it today. And the Conservative Party, the ruling Conservative Party, has been in convulsions. We've been through, I think, 5 prime ministers since the referendum, including 3 last year. So they've had their own issues to deal with, and I think Nicola Sturgeon wanted to almost get ahead of the process of these debates by asking the Supreme Court herself whether Holyrood could have a referendum, and they said no. So I think since devolution, which was in 1999, the phrase that's often used about civil servants and politicians in London is devolve and forget. So they created the Scottish Parliament, and then they just thought, we'll just leave the Scots to do their own thing now. And in a sense, there has been a real sort of divide between Scotland and England in ways that didn't exist before. So the Scottish Parliament is the main area of debate in Scotland now. We have different stories on the front of our newspapers than they do in England. We have different stories leading our news bulletins than they do in England. We have different arguments about different subjects. And Westminster has begun to feel quite far away for Scots. If you go back to the Margaret Thatcher's government, Tony Blair's government, there were always Scots in big jobs. So Gordon Brown was Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher had a number of Scottish cabinet ministers, Tony Blair had lots of them because a lot of Scots kept their seats when English Labour lost them during the Thatcher years, so that you had these experienced people. But since devolution, there are a lot of jobs now that Scottish MPs can't do, such as Education Secretary or Health Secretary or whatever, because those matters are no longer within their purview, if you like, that those matters as a Scot have been devolved to the Scottish Parliament. So you can't really have a Scottish MP running English education when they have no say over what happens in Scotland. So there is a danger that culturally and politically, the divide between Scotland and England has grown, and that possibly explains the success of the SNP over the last couple of decades, and has pushed more people towards thinking that independence might be a good idea. They're up at around about between 45 and 50% now. So it's a very well established option for lots of Scots that independence is the right path to go down. So that's something we live with now.
Even though many powers had been devolved to Scotland by Tony Blair, as you recalled, and also by David Cameron shortly before the referendum.
And after as well, yeah.
And after as well. And so one could also argue that, the Scots could be happy with this specific solution. And I think devolution in Scotland is more advanced than in Wales and in Northern Ireland.
I think it's one of the most powerful sort of subnational political institutions in the world, actually. We have full control over education and the health service, the NHS, over transport. We have control over income tax rates now. We have some control over welfare. And a whole host of other things. Really, what Westminster does is it sets the overall budget, it looks after foreign affairs, it looks after defence, but pretty much everything else is done in Scotland. And Wales is, the Welsh Parliament isn't as powerful, but still has many of those powers as well. And in Northern Ireland is its own thing, very, very different kind of story. So the Unionist parties both at a UK level and at a Scottish level, indeed argue that with this Parliament in Scotland, it would be possible to do all sorts of things to reform the education system. You know, I think the Scottish education system once had a very good reputation, you know, probably stemming back from the Scottish Enlightenment, but it doesn't anymore. There's been a real decline in the quality of Scottish education, even down south in England. They've put through a lot of reforms to try and update education, to try and modernise, a bit of diversity within the schooling system to allow experiment. And none of that's happened in Scotland. So we're still sort of stuck with a 1970s statist education system, and the results are not great. The health service, you know, which was 1948 when it was created, again, it needs reform. It needs, you know, there isn't enough money to do all the things that need done. A lot of the systems are very old-fashioned, and there hasn't really been a discussion about how you reform a health service that is funded from general taxation, so that people can get the service they want. We have an aging population, like most of Western Europe, I think, and a shrinking workforce, so the tax revenues threaten to decline even as the cost of the NHS for that aging population increases. So there are big conversations to have there. And then on the economy, you know, the Scottish Parliament has a big role in the economy. We have, obviously, like many places, oil and gas in the northeast of Scotland, Aberdeen, that kind of thing. We're moving away from that towards renewable energy, and the Scottish Parliament has a huge role to play in that, and could really have been driving the transition from oil and gas to renewables. I think they've done some things, but probably not enough, because we've had a government that wants to leave the UK, and really that's its overriding purpose, and therefore most of its attention has gone on trying to win that argument. So a lot of those other things which the unionist parties would make the case should have been addressed, haven't been addressed. You know, I think that's, as we see the polls start to shift, the unionist parties are now coming in and saying, well, if the SNP moment is perhaps end, here's the chance to make the schools better, or to reform the health service, or that kind of thing. And I think that's probably going to play more strongly with voters now than it has over the last 2 decades.
Mm-hmm. Well, this point brings us to the record of the SNP, doesn't it? It seems to be, listening to you, that the record is actually not so good. Is this the case in the economy, for health, for security, social issues?
Yeah,
how would you...
I remember speaking to Nicola Sturgeon maybe a couple of years after she became First Minister, and the business community in Scotland has constantly complained that her administration doesn't listen to them. It has no interest in them. It's not very interested in wealth creation, entrepreneurship, the kind of things that, you know, keep the tax revenues coming in. And I remember saying to her, you know, the business community says this, and they're worried that you've got no interest in them. And she said to me, well, the business community has always been heard loudly in Scotland, and I think it's time for other voices to be heard. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but as I think I said to her at the time, yes, other voices, minority groups, vulnerable groups, but also business. You know, you can listen to both rather than just ignoring business and listening to more vulnerable groups. But she focused the policy that she did do largely on, I think, trying to improve the rights and the living standards of minorities and the vulnerable. So, you know, she did things on child poverty. There's a Scottish child payment which provides something like £25 a week extra to families with young children who are living in poverty, which is great. You know, that's fine. But there were a number of other things she did, which were also, you know, the gender reform is obviously another minority group, and other things. The thing called the Named Persons Act, which was to give every child in Scotland a named person out with their family, who would keep an eye on them, and if they thought there was a suggestion that the child was being abused or wasn't being looked after by their family, would report that to the authorities. Now, I can see where she was coming from, because she was thinking about children who were being abused or neglected, and that was being overlooked. But of course, you're then intervening in the family life of lots of people whose children aren't having that kind of experience. There was a huge backlash against that, and actually the European Court ended up ruling that it was an infringement of personal liberty. I can't remember the exact details, but and various other things. So she kept coming up with policies that were about helping the vulnerable, and that, in a sense, is admirable, although a lot of them didn't actually work in practice. But the problem, I think, was that you can do that, but you also need to do education reform and health reform and think about the economy and how you grow businesses. You have people starting businesses, helping them to survive, thinking about the sectors that Scotland has some kind of competitive advantage in the future as we see the economies changing. And she didn't really do that side of it. So the big mainstream issues were neglected. And she focused very much on these fringe issues for vulnerable groups. And I think had she been a bit more proactive on the big stuff, the big mainstream stuff, then the stuff that she was really interested in, social justice, that would probably have kept the coalition together, the coalition of voters together a bit more. But over time, the metrics on education, the metrics on waiting lists in the health service, the gaps in the number of doctors and nurses that we had, that all grew. Our educational performance declined against international comparisons, so they actually withdrew Scotland from the international comparisons rather than allow the decline to be seen. That sort of, the very, I think, like many nationalist parties, they want to control the discussion. They don't want alternative centres of power. They don't want to not control the data that people get access to, but over time it becomes obvious when things aren't working. It took a while, but then the data starts to come out. And so what's interesting is that the leadership contest that's underway at present and finishes on Monday, all of the candidates have sort of, I guess, said that they are going to address the issues that Nicola Sturgeon didn't, which tells its own story. I think that they feel the need to say that. They've talked about health and education, the economy. So I think it's broadly accepted now that Nicola Sturgeon's legacy is relatively light, that she focused too much on independence, that she didn't address the big mainstream issues, and therefore whoever comes after her needs to reorient the SNP towards being a more just playing the mainstream issues rather than the fringe.
We'll come to that in a minute, but maybe it would be interesting for you to explain why she cared so much about social issues in the first place. Is this because she came from an underprivileged background herself? And then why did she focus on minority groups' issues so much? Was it because she was willing to embrace public opinion as it evolved over time? And we know we live in societies that have changed a lot, have become more sensitive towards minorities. Is this it on both fronts?
It's a bit of that. She's not from poverty, but she's from a working class family, and her politics were shaped by the 1980s, which was when Margaret Thatcher was the dominant prime minister. And if you are from the west of Scotland, so Glasgow and the areas around that was where you had a lot of the traditional heavy industries. So you had shipyards, you had steel yards, you had coal mines. And those were the industries that the Thatcher government basically closed down because they saw them as representing the past of the economy and not the future. They were moving towards a service economy and the rest of it. So, Sturgeon is from Glasgow, and she watched, and she's talked to me about this, that she watched the communities around her where you had men and it was largely men at that point working in these industries in maybe their 50s, early 60s, who had spent their entire lives in these industries, who suddenly their job was gone. They were too old to retrain, and there wasn't much effort put into retraining people anyway. So you had communities that the heart was ripped out of them, poverty rose, and there was real anger in Scotland towards. We never really voted for Margaret Thatcher in very high numbers in Scotland. It was a sort of English thing, maybe, and maybe even more the south of England that really drove her success. So that was the point really where Scotland and England started to separate in terms of their political outlook, and Sturgeon saw this, and I think that shaped her. She became quite left wing, as many Scottish people did at that point. The political culture in Scotland shifted to the left. She didn't join the Labour Party, which is what a lot of them did in an attempt to get the Tories out at Westminster. She joined the SNP and decided that actually Scotland needed to get away from England because England kept electing Conservative governments. So the best thing to do was actually to just leave them to it and go and do her own thing. So I think that was always in her, to be a sort of left-wing politician who was about redistribution and looking after the vulnerable in society. I think that then matched up with just what you were talking about, Olivier, the rise in the last decade or so of identity politics and the fragmentation into these smaller groups, and whether it was the trans issue or many other things that we see on social media and the rest of it. And I think you know, the SNP as a party as the membership is quite left-wing. I think there's a lot of groups in there who have been agitating for the government to address some of these trickier issues. And also because we had a Conservative government at Westminster, the SNP were able to define themselves as not being Conservative by doing left-wing things when the Conservatives were doing right-wing things. And they thought, the SNP thought that would separate Scotland and England even further and maybe drive Scots towards independence. So I think that was all in her mind. I think she had a natural instinct for, you know, left-wing causes. I think that then coincided with what we've seen across societies with identity politics rising and perhaps a greater awareness of inequality. And then there was the idea of actually this is an opportunity to further separate Scotland from England by showing that we care more, we're nicer, you know, we're just lovelier people in general, which I don't think is true, but that was the strategy. And the ultimate goal then was that Scotland would become independent and become a sort of Scandinavian social democracy as opposed to Anglo-Saxon capitalist, rapacious global force.
Mm-hmm. It's a bit strange because it seems to me that, you know, wokist societies tend to apply to really broken societies that are larger, more capitalistic, more broken down. And one could think of Scotland as being quite traditional. You know, you have a small population, people are closely knit, I would assume, to one another. And so why did those sirens from the US come onto your shores then?
I do think it goes back to my last answer in a way that because of what happened in the 1980s, the Scottish political culture became much more left of centre than it has at Westminster. You know, all our big political heroes are people on the left. You know, Gordon Brown was a great sort of Scottish Labour thinker. You go back further into history and they're socialists. These are the people that have the romantic air about them. I think for that reason that, you know, what are left-wing causes these days? We had Jeremy Corbyn, who took over the Labour Party in the sort of late 2010s, who went down a similar route. And I think the left, perhaps having lost aspects of the economic argument, started looking at social and cultural arguments and found these things. You know, a lot of university students who would traditionally be left-wing, you know, which back in the day they might have marched against America's involvement in Nicaragua. Well, they don't do that now. They march in favour of trans rights and you know, student debt and that sort of thing. So the issues are much more sort of generationally different now. And in Scotland, because our politics is more left of centre, I don't think the Scottish people are particularly left of centre. I think the political culture is left of centre, which shapes the way we have the discussion. And led by a First Minister, a very powerful and popular First Minister, who went down the route of embracing the woke agenda, if we call it that way. We ended up having these conversations, and you know, and an independent Scotland would be a truly woke society, where everyone would have equal rights and the rest of it. But there is a tradition in Scotland, a religious tradition, which is represented by one of the candidates to replace Nicola Sturgeon, that is Protestant and is about, you know, looking after your family and getting out and working hard and, you know, don't have too much fun. You know, life is not to be enjoyed, it's to be, you know, out there working hard, and if enjoyment comes, then that's fine, but no smiling on a Sunday, and you know, that sort of thing. So that's part of the Scottish identity as well, and it's still in there, although it's less than it was probably in the, you know, the mid-20th century and before. So there is still that sense of they're almost conservative values, small c conservative values, that are at the heart of the way lots of Scots live their lives, but the political culture is a left of centre political culture. It's a curious sort of juxtaposition. Yeah.
It is. So you mentioned one of the candidates. I'm not sure who that is, but I know there are three front runners to this election that is going to end on Monday. Can you tell us a little bit more about each of them and what they want, and of course your views on who is likely to be elected?
Well, it's been an extraordinary leadership contest. So really, we haven't seen anything like this from the SNP for a long time. When Alex Salmond became First Minister, that all happened in a very straightforward way. He was the obvious man. You know, he'd been leader before. He was a big British figure. He was clearly the exceptional candidate. And then Nicola Sturgeon was basically his progeny, or prodigy, I should say. So he took her on as his deputy when she was in her sort of mid-30s, by the time it came for Salmon to stand down after the 2014 referendum, Sturgeon was, there was no contest. Sturgeon became leader by acclamation, really. And so we're used to the SNP having that unity because they only care about independence, really, and that they would try quite hard not to have the way the other parties do it is they all end up in a mad fight whenever a leader stands down. We've seen it with the Labour Party, we've seen it with the Conservative Party. The SNP have tried to be a bit different, and you know, we're more mature than that, and we're more united, and we work towards a single goal. But this time, Sturgeon's resignation caught us by surprise, so there wasn't, and she'd been such a dominant figure that she'd kind of crowded out all the competition or all the potential successors. They didn't have the public reputation or the public profile that she'd had while working with Alex Salmond. So suddenly you had, right, Sturgeon's going, who are we going to have instead? And three people put their names forward. The first is the Health Secretary, whose name is Humza Yousaf. And Humza has been a minister for about 10 years. He's been Transport Secretary, Health Secretary, and Justice Secretary. And I think the argument against him is that he's managed to fail in all those jobs. He doesn't really have much of a public profile. He's not particularly dynamic, or doesn't come across as being dynamic. But what he does represent is a continuation of the Sturgeon way of doing politics. So it's progressive. He was in favour of the gender rights bill. He wants to kind of carry on that style of politics. He was the continuity candidate, as he described himself, and that sort of made him the favourite. We had lots of people coming out in support of him. Sturgeon basically said she'd stay out of the competition, but then gave a kind of wink to Humza Yousaf. John Swinney, who's her deputy, came out publicly and said it should be Humza Yousaf. Lots of cabinet ministers, lots of junior ministers, lots of members of the Scottish Parliament came out for Humza Yousaf. So that should really have taken him out of sight in the contest quite quickly, because he was clearly the preferred candidate of the party establishment. There was a second candidate whose name is Kate Forbes, and she is 32 years old. She is the Economy and Finance Secretary, and she is a member of she's the one I was referring to about the kind of Protestant bit of Scotland. She's a member of something called the Free Church of Scotland, which is a famously conservative and quite restrictive wing, if you like, of Protestantism in Scotland. The Church of Scotland wasn't conservative enough for them, so they broke away and formed the Free Church. And they would tie the swings on the play park. They tie them up on a Sunday so no children would be able to go on the swings, and you weren't allowed to put your clothes out to dry, do anything on a Sunday. That was the Sabbath, and you had to just take it easy and worship God on that day. And they have very socially conservative views on public issues like abortion, on sex outside marriage, that kind of stuff. And Kate, although she's 32 and very modern in all sorts of ways, adheres to those views. And so the first week of her campaign basically was journalists asking her, do you believe in gay marriage? And she said, no. Do you believe in sex outside marriage? No. Do you believe in gender reform? No. And this became, this young, very attractive sort of presence. She's really bright. She's very eloquent. She's very interested in policy. But that was contrasted with this extreme social conservatism, and it's very confusing hearing a 32-year-old woman talking about things like that in that way. You wouldn't expect it. And the Sturgeon camp obviously disagree with her on these things, so they have tried very hard to stop her winning because they want the continuity that Humza Yousaf would bring. But the problem is that in all the debates that they've had, televised debates, hustings, Kate Forbes is actually a very sort of attractive person to the general voter. So the polling that's been done has shown that Forbes is by far the preferred candidate of the Scottish people compared to Humza Yousaf. And actually, she and Humza Yousaf, we don't quite know what the numbers are because it's SNP members who are voting on who will be the SNP leader, who will become First Minister. We don't really have any insight into which way they're leaning, but actually SNP voters, as opposed to members, have quite a lot of support for Kate Forbes and Humza Yousaf. They're kind of level pegging. And the interesting thing is that the third candidate, who is a former minister called Ash Regan, who resigned over the gender proposal, so she is more on Kate Forbes' side on that issue. She has been the most aggressive on securing independence. She wants to do all sorts of tricks and wheezes to secure independence, but she's way behind And because of the voting system, what will happen is they will count the votes, and if no candidate has more than 50%, the third place candidate will drop out, and the second preferences of the people that voted for them will be redistributed between the two that remain. So the idea, thinking is, Humza Yousaf has to get more than 50% in the first vote, because if he doesn't, then Ash Regan drops out. Most of her second preferences, we think, will be for Kate Forbes. So that could push Kate Forbes in front of Humza Yousaf, and she could win that way. So that's what we're waiting for on Monday, to find out whether Kate has kept Humza close enough that she can then take Kate Forbes' second votes and get over the line. The issue there then is how Kate Forbes unites her party if she wins, because most of the kind of active bit of the SNP are supporters of Sturgeon. You know, the elected politicians wanted Humza Yousaf. So if she wins, some of them have said they don't want to be in government with her. There's the suggestion that some MSPs might even resign if she wins. But I think Kate should win. I don't agree with her views on a lot of social policy in terms of, you know, gay marriage, etc. But actually, she is by far the strongest contender when it comes to things like health and education and the economy. She is more of a centrist, more of a Blairite, perhaps, on these things. She wants a strong economy to provide high tax revenues so that you can fund healthy public services, and which is the kind of Blairite argument. So, you know, from my perspective, from the perspective of the think tank that I run, we would very much like her to get in, because she would take those issues seriously, and we might finally see the education reform and the health reform that we are in favour of and that I was talking about earlier. I don't think Humza Yousaf would be quite as energetic on that front. But of course, if you're a member of the SNP, you're not a member of the SNP because you favour health and education reform. You're a member of the SNP because you want independence. I mean, that's literally the only reason to join the SNP as opposed to the Labour Party or whatever. So I don't know what's in the head of SNP members. I'm not an SNP member. I wouldn't be, so I don't really understand the way they think. But you know, one of the arguments in this election campaign has been that because Nicola Sturgeon was so aggressive, repetitively aggressive on securing independence, and actually she didn't get support over 50%, despite all of the time and political capital she used to try and do that, that the SNP now in this new generation needs to rethink the approach to winning independence. So if it was about complaining about Westminster, isn't Westminster awful? Aren't the Conservatives awful? Why don't we go and form our own country? Well, that didn't work. They didn't manage to persuade more than 50% of the people. But what if the alternative approach was to take the Scottish Parliament and try and run it really well, to reform education and health, to have a thriving economy, and over time to be patient, and then to say to people, look at what we've done with devolution, look at what we've managed to achieve. Can you imagine with one further step to take full control of our own destiny, what we could do in that situation? And that's always seemed to me as the best way to win independence. If I was an SNP supporter, I'd think, well, get the best education system you can, get the best health service you can, you know, have extraordinary businesses doing amazing things out in the global economy. That's a much more convincing argument for independence than simply, isn't Westminster rubbish? We're also rubbish, but we'll go and be rubbish on our own rather than be rubbish as part of Westminster. So I think that argument's time has kind of arrived now, because they've spent 16 years in government trying to do it the other way. It hasn't worked. They realise they need to rethink. So the argument has been more about how do you deliver policies that might persuade people to have more confidence in Scotland's ability to go on its own. The downside there, this maybe comes on to your next question, so let me know, is that the opposition parties see their moment now, having been kept down by the SNP, have been 20 points ahead in the polls for about 20 years. And the Labour Party, which was dominant in Scotland for decades before devolution, has really lost its way and struggled to find a way into the conversation, because it doesn't want to be seen as unionist as the Conservative Party, and it's not in favour of independence. What it's about is, you know, I guess redistribution in a sense, which the SNP they've dominated that argument as well. But independence has been the driving factor in Scottish politics for a long time, and the Labour Party doesn't have anything to say about that. They don't want it. Equally, they don't want to be as kind of trenchant unionist as the Conservatives are, so they've got a bit lost. But because the SNP are now down in the polls, because of everything we talked about in the last couple of years with Sturgeon, independence is down a bit in the polls. The Labour Party have started to creep back up in Scotland, And also, it looks like we're about to get a Labour government at Westminster, which will be a bit of a game changer for Scotland, because Scots tended to vote Labour before they voted SNP. So to have a Labour government at Westminster that is centre left, the prospect there is for voters, soft voters who voted SNP because they thought they were the most effective government, might start to go back to the Labour Party, because they can see that you can vote Labour and you'll get a Labour government at Westminster. And that then allows Labour in Scotland to say to people, well, vote for us in the devolved elections, come back to us. And it's time for a change. SNP have been in power for 16 years. No government can survive that long and still be worth having in government. You need, a refresh at the top. And also, if you put Labour in government at Holyrood, we can work with the Labour government at Westminster to ensure that we're pushing in the same direction and getting the very best for Scotland, as opposed to an SNP government up in Scotland and a Conservative government at Westminster who've been at loggerheads the whole time. It's been a very aggressive and disputatious relationship because they're polar opposites in terms of the political stance. And I think maybe coming out of the populist moment, I think as we're starting to see, the populist moment maybe from the early 2010s through until maybe, I don't know, last year, which had Brexit and Trump and the independence referendum, and your own country has seen, the right rise as well. I think our voters in Britain are a bit fed up with all the upheaval and turbulence that came with that. So we now have Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister, who's about as boring as it's possible to be as a leader. Keir Starmer, who is the Labour leader and will probably be the next Prime Minister, is also incredibly boring. We had Boris Johnson and it didn't go well. So the idea of actually moving to a period of stability and stop ripping things up by the roots, because it doesn't work, it doesn't end well. I think there's a sense that a period of relative tranquility, dealing with the big issues in a more straightforward way, and getting away from the chaos of Brexit and independence referendums and prime ministers drinking during lockdown when they shouldn't be, and all that kind of stuff. That I think people have had enough of that era and want to move towards something that's a bit more balanced and a bit more tolerable and speaks well of the country rather than.
I see. And so you think that the most likely scenario, if I understand you well, is that Labour wins the next general elections in Britain, and it also wins it in Holyrood in 2026. Is that correct? But if so, is Labour really ready? I mean, is it popular in Scotland? Is it organised?
Yeah. I mean, the SNP lead is such that I don't think anyone had expected them to be able to win in 2026 at Holyrood, because the SNP are very, very far ahead. However, I was in London hosting an event last night, and we had MPs from the Liberal Democrats. We had a Conservative government minister. We had Douglas Alexander, who was a cabinet minister in the last Labour government. And all three were talking quite realistically about the prospect of Labour winning in 2026 now. And I think that shows how quickly things have changed, and how the Sturgeon has left this hole in the SNP, how the candidates who are looking to replace her won't have the same profile, won't necessarily have the same relationship with the public, and that Labour government at Westminster would give a real boost to the Labour Party in Scotland, because you can see Labour actually functioning as a governing force. If you vote Labour, you'll get a government, which hadn't been the case for a long time. So I'm not saying it will happen, but it's not unthinkable in the way it was probably 6 months ago. I think the next general election next year, so the SNP have there are, I think, gosh, I embarrass myself here, something like 62, maybe 59 Scottish seats at Westminster, and the SNP hold the vast majority of them. It used to be Labour, but the SNP took most of them from the Labour Party. I think the Labour Party in Scotland expect at the next general election to take back somewhere between 10 and 20 of those seats, and that would put them close to the SNP at Westminster, even if the SNP still had more MPs. And it then sets up the campaign for 2026, where Labour suddenly have the SNP in their sights. They're no longer trailing very, very far behind, but there's a kind of proper competition. And that allows them to go into the devolved election saying, we can do this. If you vote for us, we'll work with the Labour government at Westminster. It's time for a change, which is a very powerful message with any government that's been serving for a long time. And so that's why there is the view that it might happen. Are they ready? They've got a leader, Anis Sarwar, who is very very Blairite, very energetic, very good in terms of the media, very good on television. They have some good people at the top, not lots of them, but some. but like all parties that have been in opposition for such a long time, your talent pool drains away a bit. You know, good people stop joining because there's no prospect of winning office, so you lose that kind of thing. But they've been quite effective, I think, in the last few years about going out and bringing good people in. So they've got candidates who are standing at the next general election and for the Holyrood election who are quite high quality. They might not have experience of government yet, but you know, I don't think that's necessarily a prerequisite for doing a decent job in government if you get, you know, people with the right kind of quality and the right in that thing. So yeah.
Okay, and a final question before we open up the debate to the audience. Maybe you could point out what the key priorities for Scotland would be after the 2026 elections. Will it be public services reforms? Will it be the economy? Will it be independence? Of course, will linger on, I guess. Yeah. How would you rate those?
I think the economy is number one. We have a huge cost of living crisis in the UK and across Europe as well. Inflation is high. We have high debt levels. You know, so we need to address that, and people's quality of life has gone down. Their standard of living has dropped. So I think there's a sense that after 2026, and maybe even starting now, we need to think quite hard about the future of the Scottish economy, because there hasn't been a lot of thought gone into it. We have some good universities in Scotland. Edinburgh, St Andrews in particular do well in the international surveys. Glasgow's decent. And they're producing a lot of research in areas like robotics, in technology, in life sciences, in renewables, that sort of thing. So I think there's a degree of, well, where will Scotland be in 20 or 30 years' time? And how do we ensure that we are setting ourselves up to maximise the benefits of that? How do we provide a workforce with the skills to be able to work in these new industries, as opposed to the industries that are maybe, you know, if artificial intelligence comes in and wipes out a whole bunch of middle-class jobs and the law and finance and the rest of it, well, what are the jobs for people in the future, and how do we ensure people have the skills to do them? How do we attract inward investment, especially post-Brexit? You know, the idea of Britain being that halfway house between America and the European Union, which worked very well for us, doesn't work as well anymore because we're not in the European Union. So how does Scotland position itself in that sort of thing? Which are the industries where we can have a competitive advantage? There's going to be a lot of discussion about that. Renewables is a big thing for us because we have, I think, something like 8% of the population of the UK and 30% of the landmass. And a large part of that is up in the north of Scotland. It's there's not a huge population there. A lot of it is countryside, rural areas. It's perfect for wind power. It's perfect for hydropower. You know, these kind of conversations are taking place as well. So I think whoever comes in will have to wrestle with that in a way that hasn't been done. And we're going to have to address the crisis in the NHS, and we're going to have to think about education reform. So those are the three big challenges, and they're, you know, three huge challenges, and one of them would be big enough for a government, but somehow they're going to have to get to grips with all of them at once, which should be interesting.
Oh, yes, of course. Well, thank you very much, Chris. I'm very sure that there are many questions from the audience. I certainly have some more in my pockets, but I wouldn't want to monopolize the discussion with you. So please, if anyone has a question, please raise your hand. I think you can open your microphones as well. Yes. Maybe Ingrid has a question. Yes, Ingrid, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you for this. It was very, very interesting and very helpful to understand the situation. Maybe would you please elaborate a little more on what happens now to the independence debates? Because the British government used to say that the 2014 referendum was a once in a generation referendum. So what happens now? Does the resignation of Nicola Sturgeon postpone the next referendum to the next generation?
Yes, that's a good question. The truth is, I don't know yet, and we won't know until we find out who the new SNP leader is, because they will be in charge of the independence movement. They will be responsible for developing a strategy for independence. My instinct is that, as I said earlier, that they've realised that this constant running at the barricades, come on, one more push and we'll get there, isn't working and hasn't worked. That actually they've tried to rush Scots into independence. They've tried to gain it by whining about underperformance at Westminster and saying Scotland could be so much better with independence, but they haven't made the case. You know, there are all sorts of problems about currency, central bank, foreign policy, membership of the European Union. The fact that now Scotland, if it became independent, would have a hard border with England, and England takes 60% of our exports. You know, that it's our single most important relationship, and that's unlikely to change given we're on an island together. They haven't really managed to develop the arguments for how that would work much beyond what they had in 2014. So I think Scots have, people who are convinced of independence are still convinced of independence, but people who are not convinced by independence are still not convinced by independence. And they're a bit fed up that it continues to dominate our politics almost to the exclusion of all else. And our devolved government is, been focused so heavily on trying to get another referendum when actually the majority of Scots don't think another referendum is necessary at the moment. So my instinct is that whoever comes in next will attempt to draw breath a bit, perhaps to slow down a little bit, to look again at which arguments are powerful with Scots when you're talking about independence and which haven't worked so well, about which strategy is likely to convince more Scots that independence, that leaving the United Kingdom is the right thing to do. And as I said, more and more you hear the conversation, not just from people like me, but people within the SNP, that actually making a greater success of the Scottish Parliament is the best way to persuade Scots that independence is the right option. It would be one more step from having built a very successful devolved nation within the United Kingdom. The issue is that that'll take time. That's not going to happen in 6 months. It's not going to happen in a year. It's not really going to happen in 5 years. It takes time to improve an education system and reform a health service and build an economy. So I think, I think we're a decade away from another referendum, unless everything changed again, and I can't really see the circumstances. We had, in a sense, there was the perfect storm for Nicola Sturgeon. You had Brexit, which Scots didn't want. You had Boris Johnson, who was possibly the least popular Prime Minister in Scotland in history. You had consecutive Conservative governments that Scots didn't vote for. You had a cost of living crisis. Everything that could have gone wrong for Britain did go wrong. And even then, they couldn't get a majority of Scots to favour independence. So that doesn't work. Just the Britain not being great isn't pushing Scots out the door. So what will? Well, perhaps it is just to run the devolved government as well as you can, and hope that gives Scots confidence to say, well, actually, look at how well we're doing with this stuff. Imagine if we were out on our own, we could do even more. We wouldn't be limited to Westminster's view on foreign policy, or their judgments on taxation or welfare, the majority of which they still control large parts of that, defence policy. But that's a gamble, because that might not work either. It may just be that Scotland isn't going to leave the United Kingdom, and we've wasted 20 years shouting at each other about this, and nothing comes of it. I think the SNP wanted there to feel there was an inevitability about Scotland becoming independent. It was coming soon. Everyone stay excited because we're about to get there. We'll get a referendum and whatever. But actually, I think that has started to fade a little bit, the sense that there is an inevitability to it. I think as the SNP have gone on in government, Scots have started to think, what about the other bits of government? You're not doing that. Inevitably, is it time for a change in government, a new party in there with fresh ideas and fresh energy, some new faces? So the old sort of the pendulum that swings in politics over time, it's been stuck in Scotland for a long time, but it does feel like it's starting to swing now. So I think the SNP have missed their chance during this long period of hegemony. I think they are probably unlikely to build their support again, regardless of who wins. I think we're maybe just reaching that point where it's time for a change becomes a very powerful argument, as it often does in politics. There's the two things of let us finish the job, which is an argument governments make to get back in, or it's time for a change, which is the opposition party's argument. And I think time for a change has its moment, and it feels like we're there both at Westminster and moving towards that at Holyrood as well. So I think there's a longer game that the SNP need to play now. They used to be very strategically patient. Much of their success is built on, a few decades of thinking strategically about how you build support for independence, how you position the SNP as a party that people will vote for to be in government. But in the last few years, they really lost that patience, and I think they've kind of blown it on that front in terms of persuading a majority to vote for independence. So, in a sense, I'm quite happy with that, because I think we need to focus much more on the things that affect people's day-to-day lives in Scotland. I'd be quite happy with a period of calm on the constitution and more of a focus on health, education, the economy.
I see. Thank you very much. Cécile has a question as well.
Oui, my question was, can Scotland feel the impact of Brexit? Or how does it feel?
How does the impact of Brexit feel?
Yes.
Yes, that's a good question as well. It depends who you talk to. So the bigger problem has been Northern Ireland, obviously, and that's still dominating Westminster politics today. We had a vote yesterday on the Windsor deal, which is the latest attempt to strike a new deal with the European Union over Northern Ireland, and it went through. Big vote in favour of it, but Boris Johnson voted against it. Ian Duncan Smith, who's a former Tory leader, voted against it. And Elizabeth Truss, who was Prime Minister for about 5 minutes, you've probably forgotten about her already, last year, she voted against it as well. So it's still divisive in the Conservative Party, which Europe has been since Maastricht, going right back to the sort of 80s, early 90s. It's been a very divisive subject. And that has been a real psychodrama for the Conservative Party, and Northern Ireland has obviously been the focus of a lot of that attention, because it shares the border with the Republic of Ireland, and the argument about Northern Ireland is whether it should rejoin the Republic and become the island of Ireland, or whether it stays as part of the United Kingdom. The majority still seem to want to stay as part of the United Kingdom. So anything that impacts on its sense of itself as being British is incredibly toxic for Ulster Unionist politicians, Conservative politicians. So I think that has, that's really been the focus of the Brexit argument. In Scotland, we didn't want Brexit. We don't like it. We'd like to go back into the European Union. I think if we were independent as a country, we'd probably vote to go into the European Union quite quickly. In terms of the impact of Brexit, it's things like going through passport control, where previously you would just walk through as a member of the European Union with your EU passport. And now we've got these silly blue passports that mean you have to queue as a non-EU resident. So when you're going to visit another country, it takes ages to get through border controls. I think for a lot of companies, the paperwork that they have to do when they're exporting goods to the European Union has increased hugely. So depending on the level of export that's built into their business, they've taken on a whole load of bureaucracy that they didn't have previously. For some others, it's not had such a great impact yet. There's obviously a period of adjustment for everyone to get used to the new relationship. But I think as well, things like Erasmus for young Scots to be able to go and work and study in the European Union, and for students from the European Union to come here, that was such a well-established program, and suddenly we're out of that, and you hear a lot of people complaining about that sense that we have, in a sense, that we have become more of an island nation again. That we've put barriers up when a lot of the things that my generation and older generations benefited from, free movement, free movement of goods, free movement of people, is now not there. You can't do it. You can't move around as easily. Your children can't go and study as easily in France or Germany or wherever. And there's a resentment, I think, amongst especially the younger generation who voted quite heavily against Brexit in England as well, that the older generation, who are more likely to be Eurosceptic, have basically stuck them with Brexit, and they don't want it. And the older generation, they will die at a certain point, and the younger generation will still be outside the European Union, whether they want to be or not. It's it's going to be very hard for Britain to go back into the European Union. It's embarrassing. The economy might have changed in ways that would mean you need to go through a process of knitting the economies together again to meet the various criteria. And I think we're at least a couple of decades away from the prospect of Britain rejoining the EU. We We wouldn't have the rebate that we had that Thatcher won, which is a big part of the, you know, the argument for staying in as well, that we were in under very favourable terms. So I think we're out for a long time. There's a lot of adjusting to be done by business, a lot of psychological adjusting to be done by British people as to what their role is in the world now. If we're not that bridge between America and the European Union, what are we? Are we really replacing the European Union with trade deals with Australia and Japan? And, you know, those are nice things to have, but my God, the relationship with the European Union was the biggest, you know, the biggest economic relationship we had. And in a world where, you know, blocks are forming rather than splitting apart, Britain stepped out of the most successful and biggest bloc in the world and is now its own little thing. And that's a strange thing to do at this point in the evolution of, I think, of geopolitics. So there's a lot to get our heads around. I don't think we're nearly there yet. I don't think Brexit has really sunk in, which maybe answers your question, because we've still been talking about the nature of Brexit. You know, we're only now starting to resolve the Brexit vote and the negotiations and the rules with Europe. Then after that comes, right, where does this leave us? What are we as a country now? And that's a much, in a sense, a bigger and longer and harder question, which will evolve over the years to come. So teething difficulties, probably not quite full understanding yet of what Brexit means, a bit of gloom that we're outside the European Union for those of us who voted to remain, and a lot of anger towards the sort of older generation and the Conservatives who voted to take us out under, you know, they talked a lot of rubbish as well about what Brexit would mean. And I think there's a sense that a lot of people were conned. Your life will be improved. The NHS will have another X £100 million to spend on it because we won't be sending it to Europe. Well, you know, we're out of Europe now and none of that stuff has happened. So there's a sense of betrayal amongst some people as well.
Indeed. Alix, you have a question, I think.
Yes, thank you so much. It was lovely hearing some Scottish accent back. We were talking about the EU and the Erasmus system, and I've really benefited from it, spending 2 years in St Andrews University, so I do feel it quite personally. My question was actually about Tories, and because in your presentation it looks like they're out of the landscape in Scotland, and I was wondering to what extent, because at the same time you were saying there is still this very socially conservative part of Scottish people on some issues. And my question was, do you think there is any space left for like the traditional tartan Tories, as they were called today? Can they still like appear on the Scottish landscape?
Yeah, well, I again, a great question. I think the next election will be fought between Labour and the SNP, and that will squeeze the Conservatives out, because the Conservatives have done quite well in recent years in Scotland because they were the unionist party. If you wanted to stay in the union and you didn't want, you know, as I said, Labour were kind of humming and hawing a bit on the position that they were going to take. So if you wanted to leave, you voted SNP. If you really wanted to stay and you hated the idea of independence, you voted Conservative. And the Conservatives in Scotland had a leader for a period called Ruth Davidson, who really gave the party a boost. They rose up in the polls. She was very ordinary, and she looked and sounded like your average Scot. You know, it's not the old Etonian Oxbridge type. She's not like that. She's a very ordinary woman from Fife in Scotland. Very good on television. You know, would do every photo opportunity that came up. She was funny. She was just an attractive person. She was similar in ways to Nicola Sturgeon. But she resigned because she disliked Boris Johnson. And when Boris became Prime Minister, she thought, well, I can see how this is going to go. I don't want to be the leader of the Scottish Party and having to deal with all of the nonsense that he's going to get up to. So she stepped away. And since then, they've sort of struggled for profile. And I think for the Scottish Conservatives, I mean, there is a place for them. But at the moment, they're going to struggle because the argument is about a resurgent Labour Party. So that's where the unionist vote will go. The anti-SNP vote will go to the Labour Party. So I expect, and also after, you know, 13 years of Conservative governments at Westminster, I think people really want to punish the Conservatives. So there'll be a sense of, right, we're not going to vote for them. But again, it's about the pendulum. You know, give it 5 years and there'll be a space again for the Scottish Conservatives if they can get their arguments right, if they get the right leader, you know, if they sort of feel like they're part of the modern world. You know, especially if you're talking about the economy, it tends to be a strength of the Conservatives in terms of the business community, you know, competitive taxation. that sort of thing, understanding business and the urge to wealth creation and entrepreneurship and the rest. That I think, you know, that side of things is going to be really important over the next couple of decades. So if the Conservatives can find a way to talk about that stuff and not be seen as greedy, tax cutting, you know, they're in it for themselves sort of party, then there's a place for them. But I think, you know, like all parties who've been in power for a long time, a period on the back benches or the opposition benches is quite healthy to go away and have a think. And, you know, you take some time to rethink what your offer is to the people, because you can't really do it in government. So I think both the SNP and the Conservatives at Westminster could do with a spell in opposition where they can think, well, what is our offer now in 2023 or for 2030, when, you know, times have changed a lot since 2010, say. So I don't think there's much of a space for the Conservatives in the immediate future because of the way politics is going, but it's not over for them. It'll just take a bit of time, and, you know, the politics to evolve and the Labour Party to become unpopular again, the SNP to be more unpopular, and then there's a space for the Conservatives. And, you know, the 1950s, the Scottish Conservatives are the only party out of all of them to have ever received more than 50% of the vote. There was a huge tradition of voting for the Scottish Conservatives, that sort of religious Protestant approach to conservatism. And really it was the sort of 1980s, the Thatcher thing, that really broke apart Scotland's relationship with the Conservatives for good, really. And then we came to 1997, and I think the Conservatives were completely wiped out in Scotland. They had no MPs left at all. So they've had to build their way back gradually from that. But I do think they're going to struggle in the next few years.
Thank you. Is there another question? Maybe about political parties or some other issues? Jacqueline, maybe. You want to speak?
Yes. The Scottish population is less than 10%, I think, from in the United Kingdom, and Scotland contributes substantially to the British economy, especially in floating turbines, in all the new energy. Is it really a point which will be important in the future?
Well, Scotland does obviously contribute to the UK economy, but all the serious analysis that's been done of the economics suggests that Scots get something like £2,000 per person more than people in England do from the Union, if you like. So basically the way funding works is that Scots get £2,000 more per head than you do if you're an English person in terms of government spending, so on everything, education, welfare. And in part that's because we have tried in Britain to have a degree of uniformity in the quality of public services, and it's more expensive to provide schools in the remote parts of Scotland than it is in the urban parts of the UK. It's more expensive to travel around in Scotland because the distances are longer and than it is if you're in London or wherever. So you know, the view was it's more expensive to live in Scotland than it is in other parts and to provide those services. So Scots get more and have for a long time spent on them than other parts of the UK do, and that can sometimes create a bit of an argument. The Scottish government's own figures show that I think there would be something like, if Scotland had become independent, there would be something like a £12 billion deficit on day one, which would be huge and very damaging for any new economy going into the markets and trying to borrow money to fund its debt, etc. So I think it's generally accepted that the first decade or more of an independent Scotland would be economically very, very difficult. The question is whether you think it's worth it for what would come after that, and you know, the impact on the poorest in society, because there'd be less money for public services. Taxes would have to go up to fund the £12 billion hole. So you know, it's the poorest in society as ever that would be hardest hit by this. So I think in terms of the turbines and energy, that's one of the prizes for Scotland. You know, we need to maximise what we have, and one of the things we have is lots of space, lots of wind, We have, rough seas as well, so getting the offshore wind as well, which is something that the government is trying to do at the moment. And then figuring out how you distribute that around the UK. Our energy prices are horrible in Scotland at the moment. I don't know what they're like in France. I presume they're high, Ukraine and the rest of it. But it can be a source of contention in Scotland because we have access to this resource in terms of renewable energy. We had obviously access to oil and gas in the North Sea, and yet we are, if you like, energy poor. Our energy is expensive, and we don't seem to have benefited at all from all of this stuff. But I think there's a job to be done there. We haven't made the most of that. If I was the Scottish government, I'd be looking at renewables and the possibility of, as technology develops, being able to sell this energy, whether it's not just to England but overseas as well, and building expertise, building supply lines, being able to export professional expertise, being able to export some of the things that we can make in terms of turbines, and just building an industry that actually puts us out there, maybe with some of the Scandinavian countries. I know Germany's good on this as well, but Denmark is the one that's often used, that's created a real industry out of renewables. And Scotland should have done that, but didn't, and needs to get on that train now. And I think that would be a huge boost to our economy in the years ahead. But at the moment, Scotland benefits economically from being in the Union far more. It takes more from the Union than it puts in. So that was something the SNP tried to argue wasn't true, but their figures didn't stack up. So I think most people accept that that there would be a price to pay from leaving the Union, and we would have to be very smart very quickly to try and fill the gap that would be left.
Mm-hmm. I see. Is there another question? I think Alex has another question. Go ahead, Alex.
Okay, so sorry.
All right.
But it's just fascinating. I was wondering if the coronation that is going to happen is a topic in Scotland right now, because I heard something about the Stone of Destiny will have to be brought back. And I was wondering, because the Queen died in Scotland, and in a way all the eyes were turned into this beautiful landscapes, and it was such a show of, Britishness, but also with Scotland being such, a display, showing all this the natural landscape and beauty. And I was wondering to what extent is that proof that there is still an attachment to British monarchy, and if that has still an impact on independence as such in people thinking, and if the coronation is going to bring some movement to that.
Yeah, brilliant point, actually. And this is something that unionists struggle with. What is the case for Britishness? So I don't mean, there's an economic case, but if your country's staying together because it's too expensive to leave, then that's not really a long-term argument for staying. It can't just be about money. There has to be more to your identity, shared identity, to solidarity than that. And if you look back to the end of the Second World War, Britain's, Scots and English, Northern Irish, and they'd all fought together, they died together. There was that sense of patriotism, sacrifice. We set up the NHS. We improved the welfare system, and being British meant something. You were creating a modern country coming out of the Second World War, a welfare state. The British flag, as times of war, you always have, that sense of patriotism. But that's, I think, over time, those things fade, because they always do. We don't really want another war to bring back that sense of patriotism. Seems a bit much to ask. So what is Britishness now? And if you look at the polls of Scottish identity, especially over the last sort of 20 or 30 years, the number of people who would say they feel British more than Scottish has dropped considerably. The number of people who say they feel Scottish more than British has risen. And the number of people who say they feel Scottish and not British has also risen. So there's been a real separation in terms of Scottish identity, British identity, and whether there's much of a link between the two. We have institutions like the BBC, which is a big British thing, the NHS, which is shared across the United Kingdom, and the royal family, which is at the heart of our constitution. I think the death of the Queen caught a lot of people by surprise. Not that she died, because she was an old woman by that point. but I think the emotional impact that that had on lots of people caught a lot of us by surprise. It was genuinely very upsetting, and I didn't expect. You know, I knew I'd be sad because, but I was genuinely highly emotional about it, and everyone I knew did, including people who are not monarchists. And I think it's that partly that sense that as long as I had been alive, the Queen had been at the top of the tree. You know, she was there every Christmas doing her Christmas reading. She was in the newspapers. You know, you went through the Diana situation. You went through the William and Harry situation. You went through the death of her mother. All of these things are a bit of a soap opera, but we all went through them together, and it was a big part of our national culture. It might be a ridiculous part of the national culture, you know, having a monarchy in this day and age, but it kind of worked. And she was clearly a woman of great integrity and sacrificed her life to that role, which doesn't look like a lot of fun at times. I think, therefore, that was a moment. Her funeral was a big moment for Britain, and you know, all the tradition, the funeral service, the military, the horses, the drums, all of that was really something. But the Queen's gone now, and Charles has come in. We've had all the Prince Harry stuff, which has not been great for the royal family. You know, whatever side of that argument people choose to be on, if you choose to be on any side, but it's kind of cheapened everything. You know, just the Oprah Winfreyization of the British monarchy. They really didn't need that at this moment. And I think Charles is liked well enough. He certainly doesn't command the affection and respect that Elizabeth had, which was in part down to her personality, but also the duration of her life and her time as monarch. So I don't think the coronation this time will bring people together, maybe in the way that Elizabeth's coronation did, but that was back in the I think the 50s, wasn't it? So again, that was the post-war Britain. It's a very different time, and I just don't think, you know, people are much less deferential than they used to be. I think the royal family isn't what it used to. People don't look at it the way they used to look at it. You know, there's been too much, almost too much damage done to it over the years by the behaviour of members of the royal family. Perhaps the sort of privilege that they're allowed has jarred with a lot of the poverty that we see around us. You know, the Republican. I don't think Britain will be a republic anytime soon, but nevertheless, the sort of passion and love for the monarchy has dropped, and certainly has dropped since the death of Elizabeth. So I think, you know, people will watch the coronation on television. I don't think there will be many street parties in Scotland. That's just not how we tend to do it these days. Lots of people won't watch it. But it's almost more of a soap opera than it is a sort of constitutional thing these days. It's reading about them in the newspapers and what's going to happen to Andrew. Is he going to end up in court, or, you know, is Harry going to come back? Will he stay with Meghan? Will William and Harry ever make up? Do we like Camilla or do we not like? I mean, it's a human story rather than a constitutional story these days, and that's a problem for them, because if it's a constitutional story, they're up there and they're kind of untouchable. But when you let daylight in upon magic, then the magic goes and you're left with a bunch of flawed human beings. And that's a much easier thing to take against than something that's there as a constitutional kind of security blanket, which is what it is. You know, no matter how powerful the Prime Minister, they have to answer to the monarch, who is apolitical. And that works quite well in practice. If not, it works better in practice than in theory, which is an odd thing. So that allows, you know, something that's so many hundreds of years old and not particularly well suited to modern times to maintain a degree of consent among the British people. But that's not the same thing as deference and affection and, you know, going out and celebrating because the king's had a crown put on his head. That's just not, certainly in Scotland now, that's not really how people behave.
Sorry, what about the stone then? Is it stuck?
Well, so the Stone of Destiny was you know, brought back to Scotland, I think it was in like 1997, 96, and it had sat in London for a long time. It was the historic stone that the kings of Scotland in medieval and earlier times would be crowned. They would sit on it and they would be crowned. And then when the Union was formed, the Stone of Destiny went down to, I think, Westminster Abbey. It was famously stolen by a couple of Scottish students who drove down, I think, in an old Morris Minor car in the 70s, 60s, 70s, 60s, I don't know. And they went in and they stole the Stone of Destiny and put it in the boot of the car and drove it back to Scotland. And it was hidden for years. And then, anyway, it went back. So as part of this, the the coronation, the question was, would the Stone of Destiny go down and be put under the chair that Charles is crowned on? Because that's what's happened with previous monarchs. And the SNP candidates were asked, would you allow this to happen? And Alex Salmond, former First Minister, came out and said, we shouldn't let them have the Stone of Destiny because they might not give it back again. And then, you know, a couple of the candidates came out and said, you're quite right, we're not going to let them have the Stone of Destiny. I mean, it's ridiculous and a sort of caricature of Scottish nationalism, just preposterous. So I suspect the Stone of Destiny will go down when, you know, when in time for the coronation. And if it doesn't, who cares? You know, I think we can probably move on from all of that stuff. So maybe a more modern and 21st century Britishness would be quite welcome.
Thank you so much.
Is there another question, or not? Shall we call it a close? Or I actually had a question myself, Chris, if you don't mind. It was about not only the monarchy. I had this question lined up as well, but about the levelling up agenda of the British Tories. Has it benefited Scotland at all over the last years, or not?
A bit. So one of the things the British government has tried to do in an attempt to bolster the union, to strengthen the union, is that it started doing deals with regional bits of Scotland, so councils in Scotland, council areas, where it's provided money for specific projects. So that, you know, you'll have these projects and there'll be a Union Jack attached to them as opposed to a saltire. So people will see visible evidence of the benefits the union brings to Scotland. So some communities, you know, there were city deals done for Glasgow and Edinburgh and Dundee and Stirling and places like that, which, you know, the British government would put in X hundred million and the Scottish government would match it. So you had the two governments working together. From the unionist perspective, that's a nice thing to see. But to be honest, the levelling up agenda directly is about the Westminster government doing things in England. So it's about the north of England, the northern powerhouse, as they call it. It's about the Midlands of England, the Midlands engine, as they call it. It's the idea that, you know, the southeast is by far the wealthiest part of the UK, heavily driven by London. And the rest of England has been neglected over the years. All the big businesses are in the southeast, you know, all the wealth is in the southeast. So can you start to share that around the rest of the United Kingdom? The issue for Scotland is that, and I'll come back to the point about nationalists, is that they tend to want everything centralised. So they've centralised the police. They have taken powers away from local government. They want to control the narrative about what Scotland is and what's working in Scotland, and you know, the direction of travel for Scotland. And actually, one of the frustrating things for me and for my think tank and for you know, a policy community beyond that is that we want strengthened local governments. We want councils to have more powers, more economic power. So, you know, if you're a council in, say, Inverness in the north of Scotland, the challenges you face are very different from the challenges you face if you're running Glasgow City Council, which are very urban, or in the border area, you know, they're very different again. So you've got rural councils, you've got urban councils, you've got suburban councils, you've got councils in the west of Scotland that are still struggling with the 1980s death of the heavy industries. You've got Edinburgh, which is actually Scotland's London now in a way. You know, it's got its financial sector, it's got its legal sector, it's got the better university research organisations and that sort of thing. So the argument would be give councils power so that they can address more directly the problems and challenges of their own areas. Give them, you know, the power to tax as they see fit. Give them more control over bits of education and the rest of it. But the SNP hasn't wanted to do that. It's wanted to keep everything controlled from the centre. I don't think you can level up that way, and I think as we're seeing in England, you know, they've created these directly elected mayors. So we have Andy Burnham in Greater Manchester, Andy Streets in the West Midlands, and these are new offices where you have a mayor who is directly accountable to the population, and they're gaining more power as time goes on. We don't have anything like that in Scotland, and the idea that Glasgow doesn't have a mayor, a directly elected mayor, is ridiculous to me. You know, London has its mayor. Why shouldn't Glasgow? Someone who can put themselves up for election and say, I'm going to do the following 3 things, and if I don't, you can vote me out at the next election. In Scotland, most people couldn't name the leader of their council, the leader of their local authority. They're just a kind of amorphous bunch of faceless, second-rate politicians. So there isn't really the capacity to level up. Local government would be the obvious way to do that. and hopefully that's another debate that's coming as we move into the next era of devolution. But how we, a lot of power devolved from Westminster to the Scottish Parliament, and then the Scottish Parliament hasn't devolved any power further down into Scotland. Well, that needs to change. So the next argument about devolution is not necessarily about more powers for the Scottish Parliament, but about the Scottish Parliament giving power down to communities that would allow a bit more flexibility and nuance in how they shape the future of their own communities.
Mm-hmm. Maybe to the Council of Ullapool as well, where we will be traveling.
Yes.
Very soon. Have you ever been to Ullapool? Can you tell us how beautiful it is? Or so that more
it's very beautiful, of course, because anywhere north of Perth in Scotland is beautiful. Once you get away from people, it becomes very beautiful. Indeed, I haven't been to Ullapool, I'm afraid, but it's a lovely part. Everything up there is lovely. There's lots of trees and lots of lochs, lots of birds. Lovely roads, mountains. You'll love it. It's gorgeous.
Okay, well, I'm sure we will love it, and we will make sure to send you a postcard.
Oh, please do.
And
have a great time.
So with this, I'd like to close the event, unfortunately, because it's been really, really fascinating to listen to you, and I've had many comments that said this. Chris, thank you very much indeed. It's been great, and I hope we can keep in touch.
Oh, thank you for having me. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and all the best. Enjoy your time in Scotland.
Thank you.
All right.
Chris.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Thank you.